The conversation at the Indian Wells Tennis Garden was not about the scoreboard. It was about the numbers coming out of broadcast trucks and media centers and television networks across multiple continents. Numbers that were making people inside the professional tennis establishment genuinely uncomfortable. At the center of it all was a veteran sports photographer named Juergen Hasenkopf, a man who has spent more than 4 decades behind a camera at every Grand Slam and every major tennis event the sport has produced, documenting icons from Agassi to Alcaraz with a lens that has never been accused of flattery. What Hasenkopf reportedly said about Alex Eala in the media center at Indian Wells was not the kind of professional praise that circulates politely and then disappears. It landed like a verdict, and the people in the room when he delivered it were left trying to process what it meant. If you want to follow this story as it develops and get coverage of Eala's journey that goes deeper than the headlines, subscribe to this channel now and hit the bell. We cover what is actually happening around the Eala phenomenon, with the context and the detail that the mainstream coverage does not always provide. Now let us get into what Hasenkopf said, why the broadcast numbers behind his assessment are significant, and what all of it means for professional tennis and the people who run it.
Hasenkopf's assessment, as reported by people in the media center at the time, was direct and specific. He said that Alex Eala was the most watched athlete on television right now, not just within tennis, not just within women's sport, but across the global sporting landscape of that particular week. For a man who has spent 40 years tracking the intersection of athletic talent and public attention, who has stood behind his camera while the biggest names in tennis history played the biggest matches of their careers, that kind of statement is not made lightly. He was not commenting on the quality of her tennis or the trajectory of her career. He was making an observation about what the broadcast data was showing, about where the world's eyes were pointing when a match was being played. And his conclusion was that they were pointing at Eala more consistently and in greater numbers than at anyone else competing anywhere in the world at that moment. The television ratings that were surfacing from inside the broadcast infrastructure at Indian Wells supported the scale of what he was describing. Networks covering the tournament were seeing viewership numbers during Eala's matches that went well beyond anything their planning had anticipated. The Filipino diaspora in the United States, a community spread across major cities on both coasts and throughout.
What made this situation particularly striking for the people inside the media industry trying to make sense of it was that the viewership was not tracking with Eala's ranking in the way that professional sports broadcasting typically works. The established model assumes that the biggest audiences follow the highest-ranked players, the ones with the most titles and the most history at major events. Eala was seated 31st at Indian Wells. By the conventional logic of how tennis ratings are generated, she should have been a secondary story, a player whose matches drew respectable numbers from a specific regional audience without competing with the viewership that the top seeds and defending champions command. The data was showing something entirely different. Her matches were outperforming those of players ranked significantly above her, players with multiple Grand Slam titles and established global followings built over years of competing at the highest level. The reaction inside the locker room to this ratings reality was, by multiple accounts, not comfortable. Professional athletes at the elite level of any sport are acutely aware of attention and how it is distributed. They track who gets the best court assignments, who leads the television coverage, whose face appears in the promotional material for major events, whose press conferences draw the most journalists. These are not trivial vanity concerns. They reflect the commercial hierarchy of the sport. And the commercial hierarchy determines sponsorship value, endorsement opportunities, and the financial security that sustains a professional career over the long term. When a player ranked 31st is generating more broadcast attention than players ranked in the top 10, the players in the top 10 notice, and the noticing is not always gracious. There were reports of top-ranked players asking their agents and management teams why a 20-year-old from the Philippines was receiving more airtime and more global attention than the defending champions and the established stars. The question was understandable, even if the tone was not always constructive.
The answer, which the data was providing, whether anyone found it comfortable or not, was that the audience had made a decision that the ranking system had not made for them. They were choosing what to watch based on their own emotional investment and their own reasons. And those reasons had nothing to do with the WTA's official hierarchy. Eala was what the audience wanted to watch, and the television networks were following the audience, the way they always do, by pointing their cameras at whatever was pulling the most viewers. Hasenkopf's explanation for why this was happening focused on something that broadcast analytics cannot fully capture, but that his 40 years of experience gave him a specific language to describe. He talked about authenticity, about the difference between athletes who perform for cameras and athletes who are simply themselves when cameras are present. He observed that Eala's intensity and her humility create a quality on screen that functions almost like a magnetic field. The small moments, the way she touches her temple when she is thinking through a point, the way she looks at the Philippine flag on her kit during a difficult game, the way she smiles at her team when something goes right. These register on screen in a way that draws viewers in rather than keeping them at a comfortable distance. They suggest a person rather than a person.
Eala's emergence at this moment, with this specific quality of public attention, was being read by some inside the industry as a potential answer to that search, though one that came from an entirely unexpected direction. Nobody had predicted that the next global draw for tennis would be a 20-year-old Filipina player competing outside the top 30. The sport's commercial planning had not been built around that possibility. The data was now making that planning look incomplete. The commercial implications were being processed rapidly by the companies that spend money on sports broadcasting. Advertisers who had not secured enough time around Eala's matches were finding that the inventory they had passed on was now far more valuable than their initial assessments had suggested. The audience she was bringing to the screen was real, it was large, and it was engaged in the specific way that advertisers most want, watching actively rather than passively, connected emotionally to what was happening on screen in a way that made the content around the match feel consequential rather than background. Brands that had been slow to recognize this were watching competitors move into the space they had declined and feeling the consequences of that decision in real time. The streaming platforms were also paying attention. Reports from inside the media industry suggested that major global platforms were making active moves to secure documentary access to Eala's story, recognizing that the combination of her tennis journey, her cultural significance to the Philippines and its diaspora, and the authenticity of her character on screen represented exactly the kind of long-form content that drives subscription numbers.
The competition for that access was described as genuinely heated, with multiple platforms making significant financial offers to be the home of the definitive telling of her story. The numbers being discussed were substantial enough to signal that these platforms were not treating this as a speculative investment in a promising player. They were treating it as a confirmed commercial opportunity in a figure whose cultural significance had already been established. The tension between the commercial world's desire for access and the athletic world's need for space to compete without constant external pressure was becoming more visible as the Indian Wells tournament progressed. Nadal, who had been watching the media frenzy around his student with the particular concern of someone who understands from personal experience what sustained exposure does to an athlete's ability to focus, was reportedly protective of Eala's practice time in ways that brought him into direct contact with some of the media figures most eager to capture her. The instinct was understandable. The highest pressure weeks in professional tennis require a specific quality of mental calm that becomes harder to maintain the more the surrounding environment is saturated with noise and attention. A mentor who has competed through that kind of pressure at the highest level would naturally want to guard against anything that threatened the calm his student needed to perform.
The numbers that emerged from Eala's actual match when it was played went beyond what even the most optimistic broadcast projections had anticipated. Real-time data from global streaming platforms and television networks showed concurrent viewership figures that were being compared not to other tennis matches, but to events that typically represent the outer limit of what professional sport can generate. Whether those specific figures are treated as exact or approximate, the directional reality they represented was clear. The audience for this specific player on this specific occasion had reached a scale that professional tennis had not previously experienced for a match at this stage of a WTA event.
The infrastructure supporting the broadcast struggled under the demand, with reports of servers experiencing stress as the simultaneous load from millions of viewers exceeded what had been planned for. Hasenkopf's own position throughout the week was that of a witness to something he had not seen in 4 decades of covering the sport. The comparison he kept returning to was the quality of what the camera captures when Eala is on court. He had photographed Federer's grace and Nadal's intensity and everything that came before and between them. What he described seen through his lens when Eala played was different in a specific way he struggled to articulate precisely, but kept reaching toward the same words to describe. Cinematic, natural, something that did not need to be constructed or managed because it was simply present whenever she was on a court and under pressure. For a photographer whose entire career is built on the ability to recognize and capture genuine moments rather than manufactured ones, that assessment carries a specific weight.
The image that Hasenkopf reportedly captured at the conclusion of her opening match became the visual summary of everything the week had generated. Eala pointing to the Philippines flag on her kit and then turning toward the camera. Not performing for the camera in the way that a planned celebration is performed. Simply acknowledging it. Acknowledging the people watching through it. The millions who had stayed up through difficult time zones and who had brought the full weight of their national pride to a live stream of a tennis match at Indian Wells. It was a small gesture. It was also the most honest possible summary of what her presence at this tournament had meant and why the broadcast numbers looked the way they did. The old hierarchy of tennis broadcasting is built on decades of assumptions about which players generate which kinds of audiences and how those audiences behave. Eala's week at Indian Wells challenged every one of those assumptions and replaced them with data that the people responsible for the sport's commercial future are going to be working through for a considerable time. The challenge going forward is not whether she can sustain the level of public attention she is generating. The data suggests she can and is. The challenge is whether the infrastructure surrounding professional tennis, its broadcast agreements, its scheduling systems, its commercial partnerships, can adapt quickly enough to meet the reality of what she represents, rather than continuing to plan around the world as it was before she arrived at this level. The answer to that question will be written across the matches and the tournaments and the seasons that follow. But the question itself was definitively posed at Indian Wells in March 2026 by the broadcast numbers, by a veteran photographer who has seen everything and was seeing something new, and by a 20-year-old from the Philippines